The call came through on a Thursday morning while I sat in my truck outside the Webster County Courthouse, watching a clerk through the glass door shuffle papers whose outcome I already knew by heart. I owed $8,140 in back child support for my son Caleb, and a judge had already signed a bench warrant set to activate automatically if I did not bring the balance current by the 15th of the following month. I had been laid off from the furniture assembly plant outside Buckhannon that spring, one of nearly 60 men let go in a single afternoon, when the company moved its cabinet line down to Tennessee for cheaper labor there. Since then, I had picked up whatever framing and roofing work I could find through a cousin in Elkins. Cash under the table most weeks, never quite enough to touch both the arrears and the rent on the trailer I kept outside Mill Creek. My ex-wife Melissa had moved to Morgantown with Caleb 2 years earlier, and every missed payment cost me another chunk of the visitation schedule a judge had already trimmed once before over money I simply did not have. The number on my phone carried a Charleston area code I did not recognize, and I nearly let it ride to voicemail the way I let most unfamiliar numbers ride those days, assuming another collector calling about the truck. I answered anyway, mostly out of the same restless boredom that had followed me since the layoff, and a woman introduced herself as Denise Colby, a project manager with Allegheny Grave Relocation and Monument Services out of Charleston. She explained, in the brisk tone of someone who had given the same pitch to many men in my situation, that her company held a subcontract tied to the new Turkey Pen Fork Reservoir project above Webster Springs. The project would flood roughly 1,100 acres of hollow and bottomland once the new dam went in. And buried inside that footprint sat a small family cemetery state law required her company to move first. She offered $26,000 for the whole job, 43 marked graves excavated and reinterred on higher ground, half paid at signing and the rest paid out once the final grave was closed and certified. I did the math twice sitting in that truck, and $26,000 was more money than I had ever seen at one time, enough to clear the arrears and the truck payment with something left toward a lawyer for my visitation schedule. I told her I had never done grave relocation work before, only framing and a little excavator time helping a neighbor dig a pond 2 summers earlier, and she said her crew lead would train me once I got up there. What her company mostly needed that season, she admitted, was strong backs willing to work a hard autumn in a hollow most local labor had already turned down over what she called plain small-town gossip, and nothing more serious than that. I signed the contract 2 days later in a gas station parking lot in Webster Springs, her silver company truck idling beside mine, while I only half-read the liability clauses before putting my name at the bottom. I drove up to Belcam Hollow the following Monday morning, following directions Denise had texted the night before, since the turn-off Route 20 carried no sign and was barely visible even once I knew exactly where to look for it. The gravel road climbed alongside Turkey Pen Fork for nearly 3 miles before opening into a shallow bowl of bottomland ringed by steep, wooded ridges, the kind of ground a family settles precisely because nobody else wants to climb in after them. A handful of collapsed homesteads still stood scattered through the trees, roofs caved under decades of snow, and at the center of the hollow sat the Cutlip family cemetery. 43 weathered stones arranged in a loose oval on a low rise above the creek. I met the crew lead that morning, a lean and sun-weathered man named Harold Justice who had spent 30 years moving cemeteries ahead of highway projects and reservoirs across 4 different states in that region. He introduced me to the only other laborer on site, a younger man named Dale Ratliff from down near Gully Bridge, who had worked 2 prior relocation jobs with Harold, and seemed as relieved by the pay as I felt myself that morning. Harold walked us through the protocol that afternoon, explaining that every grave had to be hand-excavated, since the county required photographic documentation of each set of remains before any transfer to new caskets took place. He handed me a laminated survey map showing 43 numbered plots cross-referenced against county burial records stretching back over 150 years, the earliest legible stone dated 1851. Harold mentioned almost in passing while unloading shovels from the truck bed that an old man named Emmett Cutlip still lived alone in the hollow, the last of the family on that land, and had signed off on the relocation without much visible enthusiasm about any of it. I asked whether that struck him as strange, an old man watching strangers dig up his own kin from ground his people had worked for generations, and Harold only shrugged and said it was about the most ordinary thing in his entire line of business. We started that same afternoon on the graves nearest the creek, the ones lowest on the survey and first to flood once the dam gates finally closed. And the work went slower than anything I had done in framing before it. Harold taught me to open a grave in careful layers, cutting a clean rectangle through the sod before switching to hand tools near the estimated depth, logging soil changes and artifacts for the county the whole way down. The first several graves matched expectations well enough: collapsed pine coffins, brittle bone, a scrap of fabric or a rusted nail, all of it lifted gently into new containers and labeled against the stone above it. It was grim work, and I thought more than once about what Caleb would say if he knew his father spent that autumn digging up strangers in a hollow 40 minutes from anywhere. Though the money made it easier to swallow each day. Emmett Cutlip appeared on our third day, walking slowly down from a small house tucked into the trees at the head of the hollow. An old man well into his 80s with eyes that studied each of us longer than felt entirely comfortable to stand under. He asked Harold once, in a voice rougher than his years, whether we intended to move every single stone in that ground, or only the ones already marked plainly on the county survey map the office had given us. Harold assured him we were working strictly off the manifest, 43 graves matching 43 stones, and Emmett only nodded slowly before turning and walking back up toward his house without another word to either one of us that afternoon. I mentioned the exchange to Dale that evening while we loaded the truck, and he admitted he had noticed the same tension in the old man, something closer to a specific fear than ordinary grief over disturbed family graves left untended for years. Denise's office paid us out weekly rather than at the end of the full contract, $450 deposited every Friday afternoon directly into whichever bank account each of us had listed on our original paperwork with the company. It was steady money in a part of the state where steady money had grown scarce, and I found myself, over those first 2 weeks, settling into the rhythm of that hollow the way a man settles into any hard job that finally pays enough to matter to him. We rose before full light most mornings, worked until the sun dropped low behind the western ridge, and spent our evenings around a small fire Harold kept going near the equipment shed, trading stories about other jobs in other towns while Scout paced restlessly at the edge of that firelight. Dale talked mostly about Angela and a daughter they were expecting sometime the following spring, counting down the months out loud some evenings, the way a man counts down a sentence he is glad to almost be finished serving. I talked less about Caleb than I probably should have, mostly because talking about him out loud in that particular hollow felt, even then, like inviting something into a conversation that had no business anywhere near my son. This small wrongness started during our second week. Once we moved deeper into the cemetery toward the older graves, the manifest listed only by surname and an approximate decade rather than a carved date. The 11th grave we opened, marked for a man named Obadiah Cutlip, who supposedly died around 1890, came up almost entirely empty, the coffin intact but holding only a scattering of small animal bones and a handful of rusted nails inside it. Harold logged it as a probable historical relocation, the kind of thing he said happened on old family cemeteries where a body had been quietly moved decades earlier without anyone bothering to update the stone above the original plot. I accepted that explanation easily enough at the time, mostly because I badly wanted to, and we moved on to the 12th grave the next morning without dwelling on it any further between the three of us. 3 days later we opened grave number 19 and found the opposite problem. A coffin holding what Harold's careful count suggested were 2 separate people rather than the single body the headstone accounted for above it. The smaller skeleton sat positioned beneath the larger one in a way that looked deliberate, as though placed there sometime afterward instead of buried alongside the first body during the very same burial. Harold photographed everything and noted the discrepancy in his log, though he seemed less troubled by it than I expected, telling me old rural cemeteries often held more bodies than the county's incomplete records had ever properly counted across so many generations. That same week, I noticed something else I could not easily explain away. A set of narrow footprints crossing the soft ground near the fence some mornings, leading from the tree line toward the newly opened graves before stopping abruptly halfway back across the clearing. I also found, on the coffin lid of grave number 22, a row of small scratches on the inside face of the wood, shallow and evenly spaced, running the full length of the lid from the head end down toward the feet. Harold offered an explanation involving root pressure and shifting soil over so many decades, but the marks looked, to my own eye at least, considerably more deliberate than anything a root could have carved into century-old pine. I asked Emmett about the footprints the next time he came down, and he studied them a long moment before telling me deer moved through that hollow at night, same as they always had. An answer that did not match the shape of what I had actually seen pressed into that mud. Harold set up a small work camp near the equipment shed that first week, since the drive back down to Route 20 ate close to an hour each way, and none of us could spare that much daylight so late in the season. I pitched my own tent 30 yards from Dale's, close enough to hear the generator running through the night, and Harold slept in a small camper trailer he towed up from Sutton for jobs exactly like this one every autumn season. Harold kept an old blue heeler named Scout, tied near the camper most days. A dog he said had worked a dozen relocation sites with him without ever once causing him any real trouble worth mentioning to anyone before that job. Scout would not come within 30 feet of the cemetery's center plot, no matter how Harold coaxed her, planting all 4 feet in the dirt and refusing to move another inch closer, no matter what treat he offered that morning. She took to sleeping outside my own tent instead of Harold's camper starting around the same week the footprints first appeared, whining low in her throat some nights at exactly the hour I had started noticing the light, turning strange over the ridge. I asked Harold once whether Scout had ever acted that way on any of his previous jobs, and he admitted, a little reluctantly, that she had done something similar only once before, on a small church cemetery outside Beckley. That job, he said, had given him more trouble than any other site he had worked across 30 years in that particular business, though he would not say much more about what the trouble had actually involved that season. He only told me he had finished it in 11 days flat, rather than the 3 full weeks it should have reasonably taken a crew his size to complete properly under normal circumstances that same year of his career. I let the subject drop that morning, mostly because I did not yet have the fuller picture. Ruth Seldomridge and Pearl Ann Dillard would eventually hand me piece by piece over the following 2 long weeks of work. Scout's whining still felt, at that early point, like something a dog could reasonably do for 100 ordinary reasons that had nothing at all to do with whatever lay in the ground beneath her tied stake. The investigation began the following Saturday, my first day off in 2 weeks, when I drove into Webster Springs looking for answers rather than another shift of careful digging under Harold's steady watch. I stopped first at a country store along Route 20 run by a woman named Ruth Seldomridge, who Dale said kept the closest thing to a working memory of that hollow's history still left anywhere in that whole town. Ruth was somewhere in her 70s, restocking a shelf of canned goods while she talked, and her expression shifted the moment I mentioned exactly where I had been working those past 2 weeks of digging. She told me the Cutlip family had stayed isolated even by the standards of a hollow that isolated, and that her own mother used to say the family never let a body sit unburied more than a single day no matter the weather that season. When I asked why that particular detail had stuck with her mother long enough to repeat it decades later, Ruth grew quieter and said some families up in those hollows kept old habits that once made sense, even if nobody left alive could fully explain them anymore to a stranger. I asked whether the cemetery had ever been disturbed before our own crew arrived that autumn, and her face changed in a way that told me I had finally landed on the right question to ask her that morning. She admitted a smaller mill pond dam had gone in along that same creek back in 1936, requiring a partial relocation of the oldest graves under a similar county order handed down at that same time. The crew who did that earlier job, 4 men out of Sutton, ran into trouble finishing it, and one of them walked off the job midway through and was never once seen again anywhere in that county afterward. Ruth would not say much more beyond that, suggesting instead I speak with the County Historical Society 2 streets over if I wanted anything more concrete than an old woman's second-hand memory of half-remembered stories. The Historical Society occupied a single room above the public library, staffed that Saturday by a retired schoolteacher named Pearl Ann Dillard, who clearly relished someone finally interested in the county's stranger history for once. She found the 1936 file within about 20 minutes, a thin folder documenting the partial move of a dozen graves from that same cemetery ahead of the earlier mill pond project years before. The file held a short and oddly worded letter from the crew foreman, a man named Silas Odom, requesting extra payment for what he called extraordinary difficulty, though he never once specified what that difficulty had actually involved. Pearl Ann also found a newspaper clipping from later that same year reporting that one of Odom's laborers, a man named Rufus Blevins, had gone missing from a boarding house in Sutton and was presumed to have simply moved on for work. A second clipping, tucked behind the first, inside that same folder, noted that Silas Odom himself had refused every subsequent contract offered to him involving cemetery relocation for the remainder of his working life, a fact the reporter mentioned only in passing as an odd professional footnote. Pearl Ann said county gossip at the time suggested Odom kept a loaded revolver on his nightstand every single night for the remainder of his life afterward, sleeping with the lamp burning low until the night he finally passed. She admitted she had never found any solid way to confirm that particular detail beyond the same secondhand talk everyone else in that small town still repeated about him decades after his own eventual death. I asked whether the county held any older records specifically about the Cutlip family itself, and Pearl Ann disappeared into a back room for half an hour before returning with a slim ledger salvaged from a defunct Free Will Baptist church that once served that hollow. The ledger, kept by a circuit preacher named Reverend Amos Tackett, recorded baptisms and burials for the hollow, going back to the earliest documented Cutlip settlement on that particular stretch of ground. One recurring note besides several burial entries caught my attention immediately, a short phrase reading "kept the ring whole," written in the same careful hand across decades of otherwise ordinary church record-keeping there. Pearl Ann admitted she had noticed the same phrase herself years before, and had never found any clear explanation for it anywhere else among the county's surviving historical materials on that family. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought while she boxed the ledger back up, that a coroner's report from 1958 involving a Cutlip relative used that same odd phrase once, buried in a paragraph she had always assumed was simple clerical filler. I crossed the street to the county recorder's office before it closed that afternoon, hoping to check the actual deed history on the Cutlip land while I still had daylight enough left to make the short drive back up that mountain. The clerk there, a heavy-set man in his 40s who introduced himself only as Mr. Boggs, pulled the file without much comment and let me sit at a side table copying out whatever details seemed worth keeping for myself. The deed itself had never once changed hands outside the Cutlip family in over 200 years of recorded county history, despite at least 4 documented offers from timber and coal interests dating back to the 1890s. Attached to the original deed was a covenant, filed in 1853 and never once amended since, requiring whoever held title to the land to maintain the family cemetery in perpetuity or forfeit the entire parcel back to a trust, the document never fully named or explained in any detail. Mr. Boggs told me he had noticed that covenant himself years earlier, and had always assumed it was simply an old-fashioned way of keeping a family cemetery from falling into disrepair after the family itself eventually moved on or died out completely. I also found a telephone listing in an old county directory for a woman named Verna Cutlip Hale, a distant relative living down in Sutton who had apparently left the hollow decades earlier and never once returned even for a funeral. I called the number that same evening from a payphone outside the courthouse, and a woman who sounded considerably older than I expected answered after several rings, her voice going flat and careful the moment I mentioned Belcam Hollow and the relocation contract by name. She told me only that she had left that hollow at 17 and had not spoken to anyone from that family in over 40 years for reasons she did not care to discuss with a stranger over the telephone. When I asked directly whether she remembered anything about a ring or a border or anything at all unusual about that ground, she hung up without answering, and every later attempt I made to reach her again that same week went straight to a disconnected line. I drove back up to Belcamp Hollow that evening with copied pages from Tackett's ledger folded in my jacket pocket, arriving just as Harold and Dale finished the day's work on grave number 27, one of the oldest markers in that whole cemetery. Dale mentioned that Emmett had come down twice that day instead of his usual once, standing near the fence for long stretches and warning us quietly to keep proper count of every grave against the manifest before we finished. I told Dale what Ruth and Pearl Ann had told me that afternoon, and he admitted he had heard something similar himself once from an uncle who had worked timber in that same county decades before that season. We agreed, standing there as the creek ran low and cold below the rise, to ask Emmett directly the next time he came down, rather than keep guessing at half-remembered stories from townspeople who had not set foot in that hollow in years. Emmett came down the following morning before we had finished unloading the truck, and this time, when I asked plainly what kept the ring hole actually meant to his family, he did not deflect the way he had every time before. He said his family had settled that hollow in the early 1700s, long before Tackett's church or the courthouse or any of the roads leading in and out of that valley had ever existed at all. The ground itself had never been entirely empty when his people first arrived, he said, and something had already lived in that hollow long before them. Something his earliest ancestors learned to manage after losing several settlers to it that first hard winter alone. The arrangement his family struck, passed down through each generation without ever once being written into any official record anywhere, involved keeping a continuous unbroken ring of buried dead around the low rise at the center of the hollow. 43 marked graves formed the visible boundary of something older and less visible buried at the very center of that same ground, and the ring needed to stay whole to keep it properly contained there. Emmett said the 1936 relocation had already weakened that boundary once when a dozen graves were pulled and moved without the care his grandfather insisted the ritual required during any disturbance of that ground. He said the family had spent years afterward quietly repairing what that earlier crew's carelessness had loosened, though the ring had never fully returned to what it once was before that project came through. When I asked directly what slept at the center of that cemetery, he only shook his head and said some things were better left as stories than spoken plainly aloud in an open hollow with the light already failing around us. The escalating threat began that same week once our work moved past the outer graves into the inner ring closest to the unmarked center of the cemetery, a patch roughly 10 feet across left entirely off the county manifest. Dale came to my tent the evening before it happened, sitting outside on an overturned bucket while I ate a cold sandwich, telling me quietly that he had started dreaming about the hollow even on the nights he slept back home in Goley Bridge with his own wife beside him. He described the dream the same way each time it came to him, standing at the edge of the cemetery in full dark counting the stones one by one, and always losing count somewhere around 30 and having to start over again from the very beginning of that same long row. He laughed a little telling me about it, the way a grown man laughs at himself for admitting something he already suspects sounds foolish, spoken plainly out loud to another person in the dark that night. I told him it was probably just a work getting into his head the way hard physical labor sometimes does to a tired mind after a long enough stretch of it, and he agreed easily enough, glad for the excuse, and went to bed not long after that conversation ended between us. Dale vanished from his tent sometime during the night after we opened grave number 36, a burial the manifest listed only as unknown male, believed Cutlet family, circa 1870, buried face down rather than in the traditional manner every other grave in that cemetery had followed. Harold and I searched most of the following morning, finding Dale's boots still sitting neatly beside his sleeping bag, but no sign of the man himself anywhere along the creek or the tree line or the gravel road leading back to Route 20. We called the sheriff that same afternoon, and a deputy drove up to take a report, though the search over the following days turned up nothing beyond a single set of Dale's own prints leading from his tent toward the center plot and simply stopping there. I drove down to Goley Bridge myself 3 days into the search, unable to sit still in that hollow any longer, and sat across a small kitchen table from Dale's wife Angela while she asked me the same questions the deputies had already asked twice that same week. I told her about the dream Dale had described to me the night before, the counting and losing count somewhere around 30, and watched her face go pale in a way that told me he had described that exact same dream to her more than once at home. She asked me plainly whether I believed her husband was still alive somewhere up in that hollow, and I could not bring myself to answer her honestly, so I told her only that Harold and the sheriff's department were still actively searching every part of that ground. I did not sleep well after that, and on the third night I woke sometime after 2 to a low patient scratching just outside the thin canvas wall of my tent, close enough that I could hear something drawing slow breath between each pass. I did not look outside, choosing instead to lie still with my hand wrapped around a hatchet I had started keeping beside my sleeping bag, and the sound eventually moved off toward the cemetery before the first gray light of dawn arrived that morning. Harold pulled the crew off-site for 3 days after Dale's disappearance, driving down to Charleston to meet with Denise Colby and the Corps of Engineers about how the investigation would affect the schedule going forward from that point. He returned looking considerably older, telling me only that the company intended to finish on schedule regardless, since the dam gates were set to close the following April, whether or not our cemetery was fully relocated by then. Denise's office had hired that replacement out of Sutton, a young man named Curtis Farley, who arrived that same week with no idea at all of anything that had already happened on that job before his own arrival up there. I found myself, over the following days, unwilling to say much to Curtis about Dale or the scratching I still heard some nights, telling myself there was little point frightening a man who needed the same paycheck the rest of us did that autumn. Curtis reported a version of his own only 3 nights into the job, describing a shape crouched low at the edge of the clearing that moved off into the trees the moment he finally raised his flashlight directly toward it. 2 mornings after that, we found one of Harold's spare fuel cans knocked over near the equipment shed, and, close beside it, the carcass of a young doe drained nearly bloodless with no visible wound anywhere on its body that any of the 3 of us could actually locate. Harold called it coyotes working in a pack, the same explanation a board deputy offered when we finally reported it. Though none of us who had actually seen that doe up close believed coyotes had left it looking quite that way. Emmett came down almost daily during that stretch. His intensity sharpened noticeably since Dale's disappearance, and he told me the morning we opened grave number 40 that the ring had likely grown thin enough there for something to reach through it. I asked him outright whether he believed the thing he kept refusing to name had actually killed Dale or had done something else to him entirely that night, and Emmett only said killed was probably not the right word for whatever had happened to that young man in the dark. We found the lore reveal itself inside grave number 42, the second to last plot on the manifest, and the one closest of all to that unmarked center patch Harold had been instructed to leave alone throughout the entire contract. The grave belonged to a woman named Patience Cutlip who died sometime around 1914, and beneath her collapsed coffin we found a small tin box wrapped tightly in oilcloth, remarkably well preserved for how long it had apparently sat in that ground. Inside was a folded letter in handwriting I recognized immediately from the ledger pages still in my pocket, written by Reverend Tackett himself sometime in the early 1920s, judging by a date scrawled faintly across the top corner. The letter described a conversation Tackett once had with a Cutlip elder about what he called the border, an old and patient presence the family had inherited, along with the land when their earliest ancestors settled that hollow generations before his own arrival as circuit preacher there. Tackett wrote that the border could not be destroyed or driven off through any means the family had ever attempted across 2 centuries of trying, and that the only workable arrangement kept it fed on a slow, steady rhythm of properly buried dead. He wrote that the ring functioned less like a wall than like a fence line an animal learns to respect over time, something maintained through routine and consequence rather than through any true physical barrier at all. He wrote that disturbing any grave in that ring without immediately replacing it with a fresh burial in the same position risked opening a gap the border could pass through, and once loose it would not rest until it claimed a body of its own. Tackett described one earlier incident in careful detail, a railroad survey crew that had disturbed a single corner grave back in 1889 while scouting a spur line through the lower end of the hollow without ever asking the family's permission first. 3 men from a nearby logging camp vanished within that same month, he wrote, and the railroad quietly abandoned the spur line entirely rather than risk sending any further crews back into that particular stretch of ground again. He added a further note, cramped into the margin in a smaller and hastier hand, warning that the border appeared to remember faces, and that a man who worked too long near that ring risked being marked as familiar to it in ways that outlasted any single job. The letter's final passage, written in a hand noticeably less steady than the rest of the document, stated Tackett had come to believe the family's arrangement amounted to a quiet and continuous sacrifice dressed up as ordinary burial custom. It was one, he wrote, that no generation had ever felt truly free to refuse once they understood exactly what maintaining it had always actually required of them across so many long and quiet years spent up in that hollow. I brought the letter straight to Emmett that same afternoon, finding him on his porch with an expression telling me, before I had even climbed the steps toward him, that he already knew what I had found buried beside his great-grandmother that morning. He read Tackett's handwriting slowly, his own hands trembling by the time he reached the final passage, before telling me his family had lost 3 more members over the generations since that letter was first written down. Each of those losses came during a period when the ring had been weakened by outside interference of one kind or another. Most recently, his own father, who died in 1962 under circumstances the family never fully explained to the county coroner. That death came not long after a logging company cleared timber dangerously close to the cemetery's northern edge that same season. A coincidence Emmett said his family had never once believed was any coincidence at all. Emmett told me plainly that our contract, however carefully Harold and Denise's office tried to manage it, represented the largest disturbance that Ring had faced since the Mill Pond project back in 1936. I asked what, if anything, could actually prevent whatever was coming once we pulled the final two graves and the water eventually rose up to cover the whole hollow. The following spring season arrived at last. He was quiet a long time before saying his family had always understood the ring could be moved intact if it was moved carefully enough, body by body, closing each new grave completely before opening the next one in sequence. He said the county's plan called for something far closer to what had failed back in 1936, opening several graves at once and leaving them exposed for days while records were checked before any final reburial elsewhere took place. I brought Emmett's warning to Harold that evening, and Harold, to his credit, listened without dismissing it the way I half expected a company man in his position to do, given everything riding on the remaining schedule. He admitted he had already noticed the discrepancies himself, and that Dale's disappearance had shaken him considerably more than he let on to Curtis or the sheriff's department during their brief and largely fruitless investigation that week. Harold agreed to slow the pace of the remaining work, closing each new grave completely before opening the next rather than leaving several plots exposed at once, the way the original schedule had originally called for. He could not change the underlying deadline itself, since the Corps of Engineers intended to close the dam gates that April, regardless of what a handful of laborers and one elderly landowner might raise about a project already years into planning. We worked the final two graves over the following week with a care bordering on obsessive, Curtis growing increasingly uneasy as he pieced together enough from overheard conversation to understand exactly what job he had actually signed on for that autumn. Grave number 43 closed clean on a cold gray morning in late November, its remains safely transferred to a company casket, and for one brief afternoon it felt as though we had finished the entire contract without losing anyone else to whatever waited beneath that unmarked ground. The failed escape began 3 days later, when Denise Colby's office informed Harold the county required one final task before certifying the relocation complete, a soil survey of the unmarked center plot to confirm no additional unrecorded remains sat there before the following spring. Harold argued against it as forcefully as a subcontractor reasonably could against the agency holding his company's final payment. But the requirement had come down from a state archaeological office worried about liability rather than any old family superstition at all. Emmett came down the morning the survey crew arrived, 3 state employees with ground-penetrating radar who had no idea at all what Harold, Curtis, and I already understood about that particular patch of undisturbed ground. I watched Emmett argue with the lead surveyor for nearly 20 minutes, his voice rising in a way I had not heard from him before, until the man finally waved him off and told his own crew to begin the scan regardless of his objections. The equipment found something roughly 4 feet down almost immediately, a dense anomaly the surveyor described with clinical detachment as consistent with either buried debris or a possible unmarked burial requiring further study. Emmett grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise I still carried faintly for weeks afterward, telling me in a voice gone suddenly calm that if that ground was opened even briefly, the ring would break entirely and completely. Harold and I spent that same evening on the phone trying every avenue we could think of to have the survey postponed or waived entirely, starting with Denise Colby herself and working our way up through 2 more layers of her company's management before the sun finally came up the next morning. Denise admitted privately, in a call she asked me not to repeat to anyone at the state agency, that she believed Emmett's account of the ring completely, though her hands were tied by a contract that made no allowance whatsoever for superstition as a basis for delay. I called the county commissioner's office myself first thing that next morning, reaching a secretary who promised to pass my concerns along to a commissioner named Foster, who never once returned my call across the 2 remaining days before the survey crew arrived on site. Harold even drove into Webster Springs to speak with a lawyer he knew slightly from an earlier job, a man who told him plainly that fighting a state archaeological requirement on the grounds of local folklore would accomplish nothing. It would only burn money neither of us actually had to spare that season, the lawyer said, and he doubted any judge sitting in that county would even agree to hear such a strange argument at all that year. I sat with Emmett on his porch the night before the crew arrived, the 2 of us saying very little to each other beyond a long shared silence broken only by the wind moving steadily through the trees above the cemetery below. He told me once, quietly, that his grandfather had always warned him a day like this one would eventually come, when the outside world's own paperwork would finally outweigh whatever careful arrangement his family had spent 2 centuries maintaining up in that hollow. I asked him if there was anything at all we could still do once the crew arrived the following morning, and he only shook his head slowly and said some doors, once the county decided to open them, could not be talked shut again by any man still living. The surveyor's supervisor authorized a limited test excavation the following morning despite every argument Harold, Emmett, and I raised against it that evening, citing state law requiring documentation of any potential unmarked burial found during an active relocation project like ours. I stood at the edge of that 10-foot patch at first light, watching a state archaeologist named Dr. Renfield begin removing topsoil with the same careful patience Harold had trained into me across dozens of graves that same autumn season. The digging went slowly through the morning, the archaeologist noting soil changes and photographing every layer exactly as protocol required, and by early afternoon her trowel struck something that was not bone or coffin wood at all. It was a dense mass of tightly woven roots wrapped around a shape considerably too large and too deliberately curled to belong to any ordinary root system growing naturally in that particular soil at all. Dr. Renfield called her assistant back to the truck for additional equipment, and in the brief window while both of them were occupied, the wrapped mass at the bottom of that shallow pit shifted on its own, slow and deliberate in a way no settling earth could explain. I called out a warning that came too late to matter, and something rose from that open ground in a motion less like digging itself out than simply unfolding. Limbs too long and jointed in places human limbs were never meant to bend at all. Dr. Renfield's assistant screamed once before the thing closed the distance between them faster than anything that size should have moved, and I turned and ran for the tree line without once looking back over my own shoulder that whole way. I do not remember most of the following hour with any real clarity, only fragments, Harold shouting somewhere behind me, Curtis already gone in the truck by the time I reached the gravel road at the bottom of the hollow. Emmett stood alone near his porch with an old shotgun raised toward the cemetery rather than running the way every instinct in my own body kept screaming at me to do that whole terrible morning we lost so much. The sheriff's department arrived within the hour, and by the time 3 deputies finally made their way up that gravel road, both the survey supervisor and his assistant had already been found in a state the responding officers refused to describe in any real detail. Dr. Renfield herself was never found at all, and the investigation that followed over the coming weeks settled on a theory involving an unstable excavation collapse, combined with a wild animal attack of some kind. It was an explanation that satisfied the state agency's own paperwork far more thoroughly than it satisfied anyone who had actually stood in that hollow the previous afternoon, watching what really happened there. A reporter from a Charleston television station drove out to Webster Springs that same week asking questions about the 2 deaths, and I watched the segment air 3 nights later from a motel room I had rented, rather than face another night alone in that hollow. The report mentioned only an unfortunate accident during a routine archaeological survey, with no reference at all to the Cutlib Cemetery, the reservoir project, or anything Emmett, Harold, or I could have told that reporter had she ever thought to ask any of us directly. I gave a short statement to a different sheriff's deputy the following morning, sticking closely to what Harold and I had already agreed to say between ourselves during a long and careful conversation the night before. Something had startled Dr. Renfield's assistant during the excavation, we told him, and both of them had simply been lost somewhere in the resulting confusion of that terrible and confusing afternoon. It was not exactly a lie, though it was nowhere close to the whole truth either, and I have carried the weight of that particular omission every day since leaving that hollow behind for good that same November. Emmett Cutlip did not survive that same week either, found dead on his own porch 3 days later by a deputy sent to check on him after he stopped answering his telephone entirely that whole difficult week. His death was recorded officially as a heart attack brought on by stress in a man well into his 80s with a documented history of cardiac trouble already noted plainly in his own medical file for years. I knew, standing at the edge of that same porch while the coroner's van pulled away down the gravel road, that whatever actually happened to Emmett had very little to do with any ordinary cardiac event at all. Harold's company quietly settled the remaining balance with me directly, rather than through further paperwork routed through Denise Colby's office in Charleston, wiring it straight to my own account instead. He included an added sum he described only as compensation for circumstances well beyond anything either of us had ever agreed to that September afternoon in the gas station parking lot in Webster Springs. I took the money since I still owed the arrears on Caleb's support and the truck payment, though I have never once spent any part of it without thinking about Dale's empty boots or Emmett's warning about a ring and a debt eventually coming due somewhere. The Corps of Engineers closed the dam gates exactly on schedule the following April, and by early summer the whole hollow sat submerged beneath 60 feet of new standing water that had not existed there the year before. The cemetery and Emmett's old house both disappeared under a lake. The state was already advertising to families 2 counties over for bass fishing and lakeside camping. That same season of that same year, I moved into a small rental house outside Buckhannon that summer, close enough to see Caleb on my restored visitation schedule most weekends, and for a while I let myself believe the ordeal had simply ended once that water closed over everything the hollow had ever held beneath it. I paid off the truck by August, cleared the last of the arrears by September, and even started setting a little aside toward a lawyer who might one day get my visitation schedule back to something resembling what it had been before all of this began that autumn. Then, in the second week of the following October, I woke one night to a low patient scratching against the outside wall of my own bedroom, close enough that I could hear something drawing slow, careful breath between each pass of whatever was out there. It moved against that siding, exactly the way it had once moved against the thin canvas wall of my tent, in a hollow that no longer existed anywhere except beneath 60 feet of quiet reservoir water. And I understood then that some debts simply follow the man who paid them home. I lay there through the rest of that night with the lights off and the covers pulled up to my chin, doing the same math I had done in that courthouse parking lot the previous summer. Except this time, there was no dollar figure anywhere in it that made the fear feel worth carrying. I called Verna Cutlip-Hale's old number again the next morning out of pure desperation, and this time a different voice answered, a much younger woman who told me Verna had passed away quietly that same spring, not long after the water finally closed over Belcamp Hollow for good. I have not called Denise Colby's office since, and I have not driven back up toward Webster Springs either, though I still find myself some evenings standing at my own back door around 6 o'clock, listening to the ordinary sounds of my own yard the way Emmett must have once listened to his. Caleb stayed with me 2 full weekends last month, and on the second night I woke to find him standing at my bedroom window, telling me in a small sleepy voice that something outside had been tapping softly against the glass and asking whether I could hear it too.